Welcome to the In My Opinion Show. I am Henry Hatter, your host. Today we will have a remote conversation by phone with Honorable David Viviano of the Michigan Supreme Court, who is running for re-election. Again, welcome, Justice Viviano.
Hello,
We are,
Henry. It's good to be with you.
and
Thank you for having me on the program.
we are honored that you would share this time with us. As always, we strive to make our show both informative and entertaining. The studio staff has provided us with a backdrop with a picture and your seal flanking the State Justice Building. So you will really like what you see when you get a chance to take a look at the video. Please just share with us a little bit about you, Justice.
Okay, Henry, I am from Macomb County, where I served as the Chief Judge before I was appointed to the Michigan Supreme Court. I come from a large family. There's 7 in my family. My father is a retired judge, and my sister is a judge now, so there's a tradition of in the law in our family and a tradition of public service as well, and so I'm obviously proud to carry on that tradition. I went to Hillsdale College for my undergraduate work, and the University of Michigan Law School, and then I worked for 2 large law firms, one in Detroit and one in Chicago, and then I started my own law firm in Mount Clemens, Michigan, where I'm from. And after a few years, decided to run for the bench. I had the unique privilege of serving as a circuit court judge alongside my father for 4 years until he retired. When he retired, my sister was elected. I became the chief judge here of our courts, our circuit and probate courts, in 2012, and served in that capacity for a little over a year until I was appointed to join the Michigan Supreme Court. And then, of course, as you know, when you're appointed to a judge position at any level in Michigan, you have to run in the very next election for the remainder of the unexpired term that you are appointed to. And for me, that meant running for a 2-year partial term in 2014. And now, of course, I'm running for a full 8-year term on the Michigan Supreme Court.
Well, I certainly, from what I know, Justice Viviano, that you were a good choice for the Michigan Supreme Court. Let me ask you a quick question. When a justice proclaims that he or she is a rule of law justice, what does that mean? What's he saying?
Well, when you're deciding our citizens as voters what type of judge you would like to have on the bench, there's a couple things I think that people should look at. Obviously, someone's background and their character and integrity are very important. Work ethic, I think, is really important. But also your judicial philosophy. And as you've already mentioned, I consider myself to be a rule of law justice, and we have a majority currently on the Michigan Supreme Court of judges who follow that judicial philosophy. And what that means is that we, as judges, understand that our role is limited within our constitutional framework to interpreting and applying the law fairly to the cases that come before the court. We are not policymakers. We leave that work to the policymaking branch, to the legislature. And so our job is really to give meaning to the laws and to read the laws and give them their plain meaning by looking at the words that the people chose when they ratified the Constitution and that the legislature chose when they enact statutes. And in that way, we put together a stable and predictable and consistent society where people know the rules in advance. They're knowable to all. You don't have to go to law school to understand when you read a statute that the words mean what they say. But also, we don't have judges who try to encroach on the other branches of government and superimpose their own preferences and act as sort of a super legislature doing that type of work. Instead, judges need to understand that our role is more limited. So that's, in a nutshell. I could go on and on. I would tell you that I believe that philosophy is consistent with what our founders believed when they designed a system of government that was divided into three branches, three co-equal branches that were supposed to be checks and balances on one another, that they understood that judges would be, they believed that the judiciary would be the least dangerous branch. Because if judges stay in their lanes, then we really do have a pretty narrow and limited function.
Well, you've probably done this in a snapshot, but would you give us the antithesis to the rule of law?
Well, I guess what's commonly known and popularly known as an activist judge, which is someone who really, instead of coming to a case and without any preconceived notions and just trying hard to decide what the words of a statute mean, for example, the antithesis to that would be someone who's more outcome-based, who, because they favor a particular party or interest group, they try to work a case to get to a desired outcome, and bend the words of the statute to fit that desired outcome. And so you come at the law from exactly the opposite approach. And then it becomes much more important in a society like that to know who the judges are and to be friends with the judges, because then that can influence the way that your case is decided. And really it's sort of the antithesis of what we consider ourselves as a rule of law society, where we're ruled by laws, not by men, and where everybody should get the same fair and equal shake.
Why should this mean much to people who pursue the law, the decisions that you make under the rule of law? Why should people care? Why should students care? Why should the public care about whether we have a rule of law judge or the activist judge?
Well, if you want your vote to matter and you want to exercise your freedoms in this country by electing people in the legislature who represent the popular will to make changes, to make those decisions about the future policy direction of our state and our country, then you should care about the rule of law. Because if judges step in and override those popular decisions, whether it's through a popular referendum or whether it's through a duly enacted law, and substitute those choices, those legitimate democratic choices, for the choice of the judge, the policy choices of the judge, then we lose our freedom, when we lose our ability to govern ourselves, and we become more of an oligarchy, where we're ruled by a group of wise individuals at the top, where we're not ruled by the people. So it's really an important principle. It goes to the core of what it means for us to be and remain free as a people.
Is justice a universal truth? Should it be like attainable to human rights? We believe in human rights for everybody in this generation, but is justice itself a universal truth? Should we expect justice, no matter where we go on this planet, to be the same, or anywhere in the country to be the same?
Well, that's a sort of a profound question. And what I would say is we would hope that wherever you go on this world that people would want to achieve and seek justice. Turns out that has a lot to do with the type of government that is put in place, that either we the people put in place or that dictators superimpose on people in setting up civil societies in countries all around the globe. Turns out that in our country, our founders designed a system where the people were able to make choices and govern themselves, and where the people were able to remain free to pursue justice through the proper legal mechanisms. And so, we've tried, I think there's been a lot of countries around the world that have tried to model their system on ours, and with differing degrees of success. And frankly, you said within our country, do we always achieve justice? I don't know that I could sit here and tell you that we always achieve justice, because our system is run by human beings, and I believe that human beings are by their nature imperfect, and we aspire to do the right thing and make the right choices, but that doesn't always happen. And so we should seek justice in every case, and we should try to elect judges and leaders and prosecutors who do the same thing, And but at the end of the day, in my judgment, the system is only as good as the people who are working in it. And so we always need to make sure that we have good people in the system, in the legal system, at every level, who are making these important choices. And a lot of times in the legal system, helping people through very difficult times in their lives to try to get their lives back on track. Whether it's in a family case where family goes through a breakup, like a divorce, and you have the division of assets and child custody, or whether it's in a criminal case where someone has committed perhaps a horrific crime and had a very devastating impact on the victim and the victim's family, or whether it's in the civil realm where people maybe have business disputes. Someone maybe spent their life building a business and then is fighting to not have things taken away from them. So, we seek justice, I think, in all of those different areas of the court. But it's really important to have good people and have fair, honest people, and people who respect the rule of law, making the decisions in those cases.
Justice Viviano, I promise not to touch any cases because there may be cases on the docket that have not been resolved yet. But I'm going to try this one and see if this will fly. Has the rave over gun laws in the United States changed the manner of how Americans view justice?
Well, as you and I have discussed as judges, and if I've already mentioned today, as judges, we are not able to get into policy debates about what the law should be. Our job is to decide what the law is, after the legislature passes it, or to interpret the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, as the U.S. Supreme Court has interpreted it as a individual right to bear arms. But there's always a tension between the regulation of certain practices. Owning a gun is certainly one of those, and efforts to regulate people's rights to own a gun, and the freedom that we have as American citizens, the right to bear arms, the right to own a firearm and to use that firearm for self-defense, and so has it changed the way we view the law? These laws, I'm not really in a position to say that, because as judges, we take each case as it comes, where someone feels that their rights have been violated, or their Second Amendment rights, or any other constitutional or statutory rights have been violated, and try to decide whether, in fact, that's happened. So, I can't really make a sort of a broad societal observation, but obviously that's a politically important issue.
Then you probably can't answer this one, but it's always on somebody's mind. Will the concept of justice change in the United States after 2050 during the paradigm shift that will provide more of a pluralistic society instead of a racial society? Now, again, you can't talk on that because you stay with what the law is and not what it ought to be.
Right. Well, and your question, it's interesting to think about whether the laws will have to change to recognize that reality. And all I can say is that I hope that our country continues to improve its ability to be a place where all people are treated equally. We have on the U.S. Supreme Court up above the front entrance, it says equal justice under law. And that principle means that everyone should have the same access to justice and the same ability to be treated fairly and to have their case heard and be decided by an impartial decision maker without regard to someone's wealth or status or ethnicity or race or religious beliefs in this country. And that's something that we've been aspiring to since our founding, and that I think we're always trying to be better at. And I think that when we become, as our demographics change in this country, I'm hopeful that will help us to get closer to achieving that goal.
Okay. Again, we kind of touched upon this briefly, but again, I'd like to ask you. There are two constitutional practices that appear to be in conflict with each other. One is the right to privacy, and the public's right to know. And I know that people ask about this all the time, and we can't resolve this and how this all came about. Could you give us some clues here? Could you inform our public on that who would like to know?
Yeah, well, it's always interesting because we have lots of different constitutional rights and constitutional provisions, and they're not always perfectly consistent with one another. When people talk about the right to privacy, that comes in different forms. One is, for example, under the Fourth Amendment, your right to be secure in your home and in your effects and your papers. In other words, to not have the police come in and search your home without having a warrant from a magistrate signed on probable cause. And so we have some right to privacy within our own home. The right to know or right to be transparent is a little bit different when, particularly when it comes to government. We have things like the Freedom of Information Act to try to make government more transparent and more accountable. It's certainly an important principle in self-government to have transparency and accountability in your elected leaders, to be able to determine if they're living up to the promises they made when you elected them. And so, as a court, we're called upon sometimes to decide between competing constitutional rights. I can't think of an instance offhand where the two that you've mentioned have come in direct conflict, but I think as general principles, they can be a little bit in tension with one another. As we become an increasingly regulated society, and maybe in the judgment of some folks, that's not what necessarily the founders intended. I think that's where you sort of run into this idea where people's privacy is being violated because the government's tracking them in more and more ways in the modern world.
Well, according to the Federalist Papers, by the way, you went to Hillsdale's College. Oh, what a great college that is.
Thank you, Henry. I mentioned I come from a large family. Believe it or not, all seven in my family, all seven of us graduated from Hillsdale.
Well, I'm sure that you got a lot learned about constitutional law. That's why I'm focusing on Constitution, because you should be the authority on the Constitution, anybody that goes to Hillsdale.
That's true.
Now, this thinking about some of the constitutional papers, I believe according to the paper, the constitutions hold, at least folks who study the Constitution, hold that the Constitution is of a higher law made by the people, and therefore any laws made by Congress should be in pursuit of the Constitution. Do you think that Congress gets it right?
Well, and again, this sort of goes far afield from what a judge should be opining on in a broad fashion, whether the Congress is doing a good job or not. What I will say is that our founders designed a system of government where we have an executive whose job it is to enforce the law, a legislature whose job it is to make the law, and a judicial branch whose job it is to interpret the law. And every one of those branches has an obligation to follow the Constitution and to only exercise the powers that the Constitution gives to that branch. And I think at various times, unfortunately, we've had people in our government who have not always lived up to what the founders envisioned, I think, in terms of how our government is supposed to work. Well, and one of the things I'm very proud of is that the Michigan Supreme Court, we very much have a court who understands its constitutional role and who has stayed steadfast in making sure that we're not making law at the court, that we're interpreting the law, and that we're really working hard to try to find out what the legislature intended by looking at the words that they chose.
Should I be concerned that since 1900, our country is becoming, at least the Supreme Court and the laws are becoming more progressive instead of constitutional? We're changing from an order of constitutional government to government interpreting the law as we move through it?
I mean, I think it certainly should be a concern for people to the extent that we're not following the Constitution and we're not following the structure of government that our founders designed for us, because they didn't design it by accident and they didn't design it for fun. They actually spent a long time studying Enlightenment ideas and ancient civilizations like the Romans and the Greeks, and thought a lot about human nature and tried to put together a system of government that would protect individual liberty. And it's no accident that we've been the freest and most prosperous nation since soon after our founding. It took a little while, I think, for us to get our sea legs, but I don't think it's something that we can take for granted. And so it's important, I think, that every generation has to work to protect and preserve our freedom and protect and preserve and defend our Constitution. And I know there are men and women around the globe who serve in our armed forces who are fighting to protect our freedoms, but I think we have an obligation here at home to do the same.
Yes. Now, I'm just wondering, here's a question that may beg a lot of conversation. How is it possible that a Supreme Court judge can live his or her tenure in the courts without scandal or indiscretion? Do justices have an uncommon degree of fortitude to resist this kind of temptation, or are they Greek gods?
Well, I think justices are people just like everyone else as well. When I said people are imperfect, I think that includes people who serve in the court system. For example, my predecessor on the court found herself in some trouble and was resigned from the bench and was sentenced to a short prison sentence for making some bad decisions. So, I mentioned early on in this interview that I think it's really important that we have judges who have integrity and character and the background and experience to do the job, who have the temperament and the demeanor, that have the work ethic, and that have the right judicial philosophy. And the more people we have like that, the better our system will function. But it's not always perfect. We always have to be careful and think about our integrity, no matter what we do, by the way. This isn't just judges and lawyers. I talk to lawyers all the time about ethics and making sure that as lawyers that they're protecting their reputation and not just doing whatever it is their client wants them to do, but being counselors and advising clients on what are the proper things to do, the legal and ethical things to do. Because in this life, as you know, Henry, because you have such a great reputation in your community in Genesee County, your reputation matters, and once you lose it, you can't ever get it back. Once you lose your integrity, you won't ever get it back.
Yes. Now that you have gained a great reputation yourself, Justice, and I'm sure that you want to, everybody who goes there and sits in the Hall of Justice hope to retain that stature. Now,
yeah, and I would just spread that out to anybody who holds any position of public trust. You hope holds that trust and understands what it means to our state and to the citizens of our state. And I was fortunate growing up to have great role models. I mentioned I got to work with my dad on the bench and some of his colleagues who I have a great deal of respect for, and learned a lot about how to act and how to make decisions, and how to just make sure that you're being honest and really working hard to get to the right outcome according to the law in cases, and not being influenced by anything else.
I think that just looking at this whole process from my vantage point, I think that our country has been held together miraculously because of its justices. Not necessarily all of the legislative stuff. I can go back to 1860 or 1900 when they had cases before the courts, and all of them did not turn out the same way, that involved slaves or involved black people. And it was amazing to understand how clever the justices were to protect the integrity of the Constitution by giving due process to slaves and sailors that moved into North Carolina, I guess it was, and uh, and had the court defend these people. And even though they were people of color, but there were erudite arguments used by the courts to protect the integrity of the court and do the right thing. Don't you think?
I agree with you that the U.S. Supreme Court in particular, but courts all around this land, have had to make decisions that may not have been popular decisions, but that's why courts are there, to protect people's rights, even if it's unpopular to do so, and make sure people's constitutional rights are being protected. And, you certainly saw that at the U.S. Supreme Court level during the Civil Rights era on some important cases. But I have to say, I would be remiss at the judicial branch taking all the credit. I think of my favorite president, and one of my heroes, and I'm sure one of yours, Henry, Abraham Lincoln,
Yes.
as someone who really understood what this country was all about, even when a lot of people at that time didn't understand it. And he ended slavery, and he conducted himself in such a manner and understood people and treated people with respect, and really held this country together through its most difficult hour. And so, there have been at really important times some people have stepped up. George Washington at the founding of this country, the way the country was founded, and his decision to step down as president after 2 terms. First he led the Continental Army as general and held it together when I don't think anyone else could have done that. Without money and rations and food, but he kept his troops together long enough to defeat the British, but then came in as president and helped form this great country and its government really out of whole cloth. But then stepped down, walked away from the power in ways that people in the world had not done up until that time, and started this great tradition of the peaceful transfer of power in our country. So we have a lot of great traditions. Constitutional traditions in the judicial branch, which are with I think, a Chief Justice John Marshall, who is really
Justice,
important.
I got to leave it right there, and I got to ask you one last question.
Yes, sir.
Our time is almost over. What is included in your criteria for a lasting legacy to the Michigan Supreme Court?
Well, a lot of the things we just talked about. Having a great career to me is showing fidelity, a steadfast fidelity to the rule of law. By having what I would call judicial humility, making sure that as a judge, I'm doing the roles that our founders envisioned for judges. And then also on a practical level, our court's responsible for the local courts around Michigan. And we work hard. Our great Chief Justice, Robert Young, has worked hard for the last 6 years to make sure that our trial courts are functioning well and providing good service to our citizens all across Michigan, and hopefully providing justice to them just in the way that you and I have been discussing today.
Justice, I'm sorry. We have to begin to wind up now, but I immensely enjoyed the conversation with you. It was informative, and it was, to some degree, entertaining. I think our audience would enjoy this. We should get a lot of feedback from around the world on these comments made by you with respect to all of the issues that courts have to deal with. So I would like to thank you for being our guest today, and with that...
Henry, it's always an honor to be with you. Thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
The show will now close, and thank you for being here, and for the rest of the audience, please stay focused.